Hey there, ready to dive into some pretty deep philosophical waters. We're going to tackle ontological arguments today.
Oh, yeah, those are fun.
They are, but
Yeah,
they can be tricky too. Like, can you really prove something exists just by thinking about it?
right.
Specifically, can you prove that God exists just by thinking about it? That's what we're going to explore today. We've got a stack of fascinating sources from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy to help us unpack this question.
Exactly. We're going to see how some of history's greatest thinkers have tried to use logic alone without any observations about the world to prove that God exists.
Yeah, so no fancy telescopes or scientific experiments today, just pure brain power.
Exactly.
All right, so where do we even begin with something like this? What are ontological arguments at their core?
Well, the core idea behind ontological arguments is that if we can perfectly conceive of something,
Uh-huh.
does that mean it actually has to exist in reality?
Okay.
And ontological arguments say yes.
Really?
They try to show that God exists based on the very concept of God.
Okay, that's a big if. Like, if I can perfectly imagine, like, the most delicious pizza ever,
Yeah.
does that mean it's suddenly going to appear in my kitchen?
Right, and that's a great analogy because it kind of highlights one of the core challenges that ontological arguments have to overcome. They have to show that the concept of God is different from the concept of like a pizza or something like that it has this special kind of logical force that compels existence.
Right, okay. So who were some of the big thinkers who tried to make this case? I know we have sources from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy to guide us.
We do, yeah, and one of the most famous figures in this whole debate is Anselm of Canterbury from way back in the 11th
Oh,
century.
yeah, Anselm. Okay, so what did he say? What was his argument?
Well, Anselm's argument starts with this idea of that than which no greater can be conceived. So, like the most perfect, awesome being you could possibly imagine.
Uh-huh.
And he argues that even someone who doesn't believe in God can still grasp this concept, right? Like you can still understand this idea of a supreme being.
Okay, so even a skeptic can wrap their head around this idea. What's the next step in his argument?
Right. So he then goes on to say that if this greatest conceivable being only existed in our minds, then it wouldn't actually be the greatest, right? Because a being that existed in reality would obviously be greater than a being that only existed as an idea.
Oh, I see, I see. It's kind of like saying, a real-life superhero is much cooler than, like, a comic book superhero.
Yeah, exactly. And so to kind of get around this problem, this contradiction of a greatest conceivable being that's not actually the greatest, Anselm says that that than which no greater can be conceived must exist in reality.
So it's almost like if you can think of something greater than God, then that is God,
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
which then kind of creates a paradox. So
Exactly.
God must exist. I mean, it's clever, but it does feel a little bit like a word game, you know? Like, can we really just define something into existence just by thinking about it?
Right, and that's one of the common objections that people have to Anselm's argument and to ontological arguments in general is that, just because we can conceive of something doesn't automatically mean that it actually exists out there in the world.
Right, like I said, just because I can imagine a perfect pizza doesn't mean it's suddenly going to appear in my kitchen.
Exactly.
I wish it would, though. Okay, but other philosophers have tried to tackle this God-proving puzzle too, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. A few centuries after Anselm, René Descartes, the I think therefore I am guy,
Yeah,
he came up with his own version of an ontological argument.
okay. Descartes was a pretty brilliant guy, so I'm curious how he approached this. What was his take on it?
So, Descartes argues that God, by definition, has to possess all perfections, right?
Okay, so we're starting with the assumption that God is perfect in every way. And then where do we go from there?
Well, Descartes then says that existence is a perfection.
Okay.
It's better to exist than to not exist.
I mean, I guess that makes sense. Hard to argue with that.
Right. So, since God has all perfections and existence is a perfection, then Descartes says that God therefore must exist. He even compares it to like a geometrical proof, like you can't conceive of God without existence any more than you can conceive of a triangle without three angles.
Oh, so he's basically saying God's existence is just as necessary as, like, the most basic properties of a triangle.
Exactly.
He's kind of like a magic trick.
It kind of is.
Can you really just define something into existence like that? I mean, if that's the case, what's stopping me from saying that, $1 billion has the perfection of being in my bank account, therefore it must be there?
Right, and that's another major criticism of these arguments. Like, is Descartes just playing with words here? Is this really a demonstration of actual existence?
Right. So we've got these two brilliant minds, Anselm and Descartes, both trying to prove God's existence using logic, but both of them seem to be relying on this kind of slippery idea of defining something into being. I mean, what other approaches did philosophers explore? Did anyone try to tackle this puzzle from a completely different angle?
Oh, they definitely did. And that's where things get even more interesting. We need to delve into the world of modal ontological arguments, which bring in the concept of possibility.
Possibility. All right, I'm intrigued. What does that even mean? Like, do we need to bring a fortune teller into this?
No, not exactly. But yeah, get ready because this is where we start to dive into some seriously mind-bending concepts.
All right, well, I'm ready to take the plunge. Lead the way.
Welcome back. So last time we were talking about this classic ontological arguments from Ansel and Descartes. Can you really prove God's existence just by thinking about it?
Yeah, and I'm still struggling with that idea. If we think of something as perfect or the greatest possible being, does that automatically make it real? But you mentioned there were even more ways that philosophers have tried to tackle this,
Oh, there are, yeah.
right? Something about modal arguments.
Exactly. So, modal ontological arguments, or MOAs for short.
MO. Oh,
Yeah, they bring in this whole idea of possibility, like something could exist even if we don't know for sure if it actually does exist.
okay, so we're not just dealing with concepts anymore, but with different ways that something could exist.
Right.
This sounds pretty complicated.
It can be, yeah. But it's also really, really fascinating. So the basic idea with these MOAs is that if it's even possible that a maximally great being exists,
Uh-huh.
then, according to modal logic, that being must exist in all possible worlds.
Hold on, multiple worlds now. This is starting to sound like a sci-fi movie.
I know, right? It can get a little mind-bending, but think of it this way. Possible worlds are just like different ways that reality could be,
Okay.
right? And modal logic is just like a system for reasoning about, what's necessary, what's possible, and what's impossible in those different worlds.
Okay. All right, so how do these MAs actually work?
So basically, first they define this being in question, usually as a maximally great being. So this would be like the most perfect, the most powerful, most awesome being you could possibly imagine. Basically, God with all the classic divine attributes.
Okay, we've got our God concept. What's next?
So the next step is to introduce the possibility premise,
Right.
which simply states that it's at least conceivable that such a being could exist.
Okay.
Right? We're not saying it definitely does, just that it's possible.
Okay, I mean, I can buy that. It's not hard to imagine, right?
Yeah,
A being greater than anything we know.
totally. But then how do you get from possibility to actually existing? That seems like a big leap.
Yeah,
So that's where the necessity premise comes in.
okay.
And this premise basically says that if this maximally great being does exist,
Uh-huh.
it has to exist necessarily, meaning it couldn't not exist. Like it would have to exist in all possible worlds.
So like Superman, for example. If Superman exists, it's not just that he's a guy in a cape. He's like fundamentally super
Yeah, exactly.
in every possible reality.
Right. And so if we combine that possibility premise and that necessity premise,
Okay.
what we get is the conclusion that it's possible that a necessarily existent being exists.
Okay, I think I'm following. But how do we jump from a possible necessary being to an actual necessary being?
So this is where like the specifics of modal logic come in. In one system called S5, it says that if something's possibly necessary, then it's actually necessary.
Wait, so we're saying that if it's possible that God exists necessarily,
Yeah.
that means God must exist. That's like twisting logic into a pretzel.
It kind of is, haha. And this is where MOs get really, really controversial. Because if this logic works for God,
Hmm.
couldn't it also work for like anything we can imagine as being possibly necessary?
Oh, so we're going to have a world full of like necessarily existing unicorns,
Right.
perfect pizzas, whatever we can dream up. I mean, that sounds fun, but also logically shaky.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why philosophers who like these MOAs, they spend a lot of time trying to find a symmetry breaker, something that sets apart God's existence from like all these other possibilities.
So they need to find that special ingredient that makes God's existence not just possible, but like inevitable,
Yeah, exactly.
while leaving those unicorns and pizzas, stuck in the realm of imagination.
Right. But whether they've successfully found that symmetry breaker, that's still up for debate.
Yeah. Well, these modal arguments are certainly thought-provoking.
They are.
I can see why they're so controversial. They really make you think about the relationship between like logic and possibility and existence.
Absolutely.
But before we get totally lost in possible worlds,
Yeah.
I want to bring us back to something we touched on earlier. This idea that things can be without actually existing.
Oh, right.
We talked about Santa Claus and his white beard, right?
Yeah, you're talking about Meinongian arguments.
Okay.
This is where things get really weird. It's like, if Santa doesn't exist, How can we even talk about his beard?
Yeah, exactly. It's like saying a unicorn's horn is Barkley, even though unicorns aren't real.
Right. So Maimonidean arguments basically say that things can have properties
Okay.
and be the object of our thoughts, even if they don't actually exist in reality.
So Santa is like, we have a concept of him,
Right.
but he doesn't exist.
Exactly. Manon called these things objects beyond being.
Objects beyond being. Okay, my brain is officially doing backflips. But how does this help us prove that God exists? Are we saying that God's just like Santa Claus, a fun idea but not real?
Well, not quite. So, Meinongian ontological arguments, they try to use this distinction between being and existing
Okay.
to their advantage. They say, we can talk about God, and we can attribute perfections to God,
Okay.
even if we haven't yet proven that God exists.
So we can say God is all-powerful, God is all-knowing, even if we don't know for sure if God exists.
Exactly. And from there, they try to build arguments that lead from, like, God's being in this Menongian sense to God's actual existence in reality.
Hmm. It sounds like they're trying to sneak God into existence through like a back door.
Haha, kind of, yeah. But of course, this approach has its critics too.
I bet it does. What do they say?
Well, they argue that even if we accept this distinction between, being and existing, you still can't just like attribute necessary existence to God without further justification. Even if God is in this Menongian sense, it doesn't automatically follow that God must exist in reality.
So we're back to that fundamental question, right?
Yeah.
Can you really just think something into existence? Seems like no matter which path we take, we keep hitting this roadblock.
You're right. It's like a persistent problem for ontological arguments in general. But, there's actually one more category we need to explore.
Okay.
And it's maybe the most abstract one of all higher order ontological arguments.
Higher order arguments. This sounds intimidating, but also intriguing. What are those all about?
Well, instead of talking about God directly, they focus on the properties of properties, like going meta.
Properties are properties. Okay. I'm curious, but my brain might need a serious workout to understand this one.
Don't worry, we'll take it step by step. Get ready to dive into, like, the most meta-philosophical depths of ontological arguments.
All right, so last time we were about to dive into these super abstract, higher order ontological arguments. They sound a bit intimidating.
Yeah, no, they can be a bit much.
So remind me again, what makes them different from all the other arguments for God's existence that we've talked about?
Well, instead of focusing on God directly, they focus on the properties of properties.
Properties of properties. Okay, now I'm even more confused. What does that even mean?
So think of it this way. Every property, like redness or tallness,
Uh-huh.
those can themselves have properties.
So like redness is a property, and maybe one of its properties is that it's a color
Right.
or that it's visible to the human eye.
Exactly. Yeah. And so higher order ontological arguments take this idea and they like apply it to the properties that we typically think about when we think about God.
Okay, so instead of saying like God is good, we're now analyzing like what it means to be good.
Exactly. Yeah. Oh, for example, they might say that the property of being a perfection has certain logical implications. Like maybe being a perfection implies that it has to be exemplified by something.
Meaning there has to be at least one thing that actually is perfect in order for perfection to even be a thing.
Yeah, precisely. And from there, they can try to connect that to the concept of God. Like God is that ultimate exemplification of all perfections.
So we're basically working backwards from like the properties of properties to arrive at God's existence. It's like a reverse engineering project.
Yeah, it's a very indirect way of arguing, but it's kind of fascinating, isn't it?
It is fascinating. It also seems incredibly complex. I mean, these higher order arguments must be like super susceptible to criticism, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, they're so abstract that, it can be really hard to even grasp the concepts, let alone figure out if the arguments actually hold up.
Right. It's like trying to build a house on clouds.
Yeah.
Beautiful idea, but, will it actually stand?
Right, exactly. And even philosophers who like specialize in this stuff, they don't always agree about, whether these arguments are valid or not.
Well, we've gone through all these different types of ontological arguments from, medieval monks to modal logic and everything in between.
Yeah.
And it seems like, there's no easy answer to this question of whether you can prove God's existence using logic alone.
Yeah, definitely. These arguments really like push us to the limits of our understanding of, logic and language and reality.
And maybe that's the point. Maybe it's not about, actually finding a definitive proof,
Right.
but more about like expanding how we think and grappling with these like fundamental questions that people have been asking for centuries.
Absolutely. I think that's a great way to put it. I mean, ontological arguments, in all their like variety and complexity,
Yeah.
they really just invite us to like think about the mysteries of existence and, those deep questions that are at the heart of like what it means to be human.
Yeah, so, even if we don't walk away from all this with like a foolproof formula for proving God's existence,
Right.
we've gotten a better understanding of the power of reason, the limits of logic, and why these ancient debates
Yeah.
are still so fascinating to us today.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the beauty of philosophy, right? It's not always about like finding all the answers. It's about asking the right questions
Hmm.
and, just enjoying that journey of intellectual exploration.
Well said. Until next time, keep those philosophical gears turning and keep diving deep.